Perhaps the most profitable spot in all of poker is when you get to play very deep stacked against someone who is especially bad at poker, who also has a very deep stack. The main time this comes up is in cash games. You can have a gigantic win rate against these players who make frequent errors when you can win a lot of big blinds for them. But in order for that to be the case, you have to have a lot of money in front of you. I know in a lot of games, they cap you at the amount you can buy in for. I used to sit at Bellagio every day and play 5-10 no limit, and the most you could buy in for was $1,500, 150 big blinds. However, very often, towards the medium and end of a session, I would be sitting there with a $5,000 stack or more, getting to play deep stacked against a lot of players who like to gamble with very deep stacks, and that resulted in a very great spot for me. But I had to get in there and make things happen to get a hold of that big stack to begin with that gave me the chance to win a lot of money. So in this video, we're going to be discussing 3 hacks to build a huge stack in cash games. Number 1, splash around, pre-flop from in position. Number 2, do not slow play on the flop. And number 3, master the use of overbets, especially on the turn and river. Number 1, splash around, pre-flop from in position. You can call quite wide from in position, especially if you will rarely get 3-bet and the rake is low. Back when I played 5-10 no limit at Bellagio, there was no rake out of each individual pot. They took a time rake. When there's a time rake, you get to play much wider than if they take some amount of money out of each pot. So let's take a look at these ranges. Here's the button range versus a low jack raise, 100 big blinds deep with a rake. And here's button versus a low jack raise without a rake with an ante. And essentially what I want to show you here is that this range here is about as tight as you should ever play. This presumes the players in the blinds are going to play perfectly. It presumes the initial raiser is going to play perfectly. You can't play tighter than this, though. This is as tight as you could ever possibly play. The hands in red are re-raising. The hands in green are calling. The hands in blue are folding. Notice hands like ace-10, king-jack offsuit, queen-jack offsuit, jack-10 offsuit. These are all just folds. And, you know, if your opponents do play perfectly, you probably should fold. If you're playing a tough online 6-handed cash game, yeah, you should be following these charts for the most part. But in live poker, most players don't play anywhere near perfectly, especially at the small and medium stakes. And quite importantly, the players in the blinds are not going to 3-bet very often, which will force you off of your medium-ish strength hands. Take a look at some of these hands that are sticking around every single time in the worst case scenario. Notice like ace-3 suited, ace-5 suited, 10-9 suited, 7-6 suited, 5-4 suited. These are hands that love to call and see the flop. Now, I'm not saying you should use this chart. I actually don't think you should use this chart in the vast majority of live cash games. I think you should use a chart closer to this, perhaps a little bit tighter. This is actually a tournament chart, which presumes no ante taken out of each, or no rake taken out of each pot, and an ante in each pot. But it does still presume the opponents are going to play perfectly. So, will the players all play perfectly? Probably not. And you're in position where you get to take advantage of your opponent's mistakes the most. And for that reason, I think you can play a little bit tighter than this, but not that much tighter than this. I think you're going to be fine. Now, when I say splash around, I don't mean call with all sorts of garbage. I mean 3-bet sometimes, logically. Take a look at these hands that really like to 3-bet when you're playing deep stacked. We have a lot of ace-x suited 3-betting and a lot of king-x suited 3-betting. A lot of people find the ace-x suited 3-bets, but they don't really find the king-x suited 3-bets. Also notice some suited connectors are 3-betting every once in a while. These are pretty good hands to 3-bet and get out of line with. Also, we see some junky big cards like ace-10, king-jack, queen-jack offsuits, all putting in 3-bets a decent chunk of the time. One hand that notably does not put in a 3-bet is pocket 7s and 6s and 5s and 4s and 3s and 2s. These hands all just call. These hands really, really, really want to see a flop deep stacked in position because if you flop a set, you can win a ton of money from your opponent. Also notice here, jacks, 10s, 9s, and 8s. Don't 3-bet every time or even half the time. These hands call. That's because if you get 4-bet by the low jack, well now these hands that are normally really good shrivel up substantially. And you don't want to take a hand that has a great amount of equity like pocket jacks and make its equity really bad some portion of the time. So you'll see that you're only 3-betting it sometimes, right? And if you think your opponent's going to make a lot of blunders post-flop, I don't even mind calling with it the majority of the time because, you know, you flop a set and they just load their money in with top pair, no kicker. Obviously, that's going to be really, really good for you. Let's take a look at another spot where you get to play wider. This is now when the cutoff raises and we're on the button. So this is when we get to play the loosest against a raise on the button. By the way, you get to splash around pre-flop from in position. From out of position, you really just don't want to get too out of line because it's hard to realize your full equity from out of position. All right, Now, the tightest you can possibly play is here. You see the vast majority of pairs calling or 3-betting every time, right? Again, lots of ace-x suited, king-x suited, suited connected hands 3-betting. We do see a few more offsuit high cards being used as bluffs. But again, this is as tight as you can possibly play. And like I said, I'm going to be playing closer to the tournament range over here, where there's a lot of calls, but also a lot of 3-bets. You get to be very aggressive with deep stacks with a strong polarized range. Notice now, again, the small pairs call the vast majority of the time. However, you are going to start 3-betting more with something like 10s and better close to every time. And that's because the cutoff initial raise should be far looser than the hijack initial raise, which will let you play a much wider range, both by calling and 3-betting. Notice again, a lot of ace-x suited, king-x suited, and suited connected hands plus offsuit big cards are 3-betting some portion of the time. So get in there, splash around in battle. And the nice thing about playing wider ranges pre-flop than maybe you're used to, or perhaps playing more aggressively than you're used to, is that your loose, aggressive battling opponents will start to give you far more action. And while that is fine when you're playing 100 big blinds deep, if you start to get deeper and deeper, like 300 to 400 to 500 big blinds, if they are going to make hands like top pair and then just never fold against you because they think you like to splash around in battle, that's going to be great for you because you're going to battle intelligently and perhaps be even more value heavy than you should against these types of players who don't like to fold later. So you're giving action early, and you'll very likely get a whole lot of action later. And to be fair, the action you're giving here early isn't even like insane bad action. It's good, strong GTO action. Tip number 2, do not slow play on the flop. So many of you share hand histories with me in the comment section below, or you email me, or you post them on PokerCoaching.com somewhere. And it starts with you slow playing on the flop because you want to try to trap your opponent. But understand, you really want to play big pots for your best hands. And if you slow play when you have a lot of equity, you will usually end up playing a small pot, which is not ideal. You want to play a big pot. The best hands want to play big pots. That's how poker works. Especially when the board is good for your opponent's range, or when they're calling stations, you should raise basically every time when you have the effective nuts. Now, I will say when you're playing deep stacked, 100 big blinds or more, the effective nuts are very different than when you're playing 40 big blinds deep in a tournament. In a tournament, 40 big blinds deep, top pair, top kicker is just good and you're loading your money in. But it is not so good when you're playing 100 big blinds deep or 200 big blinds deep. Instead, you're going to want to have hands like 2 pairs and sets. So let's take a look at a common spot that comes up. In this situation, we have I think we have the low jack raising. Maybe it's the button raising. Let's say it's the button. Here's the buttons raising. We call from the big blind with this range. Flop comes 9 of spades, 8 of clubs, 3 of diamonds. We check, as we're going to do with our entire range. There are no leads when you're playing very deep stacked for the most part. They bet 2.1 big blinds. Now, some players will bet bigger. Some people will bet every single time using a small bet size. Your opponent's strategy is going to vary. Now, I will say, as your opponent bets smaller, you should be raising more often. As your opponent bets bigger and more polarized, you should raise less often. But what I want to show you here is that the best hands, especially the best hands that don't block the opponent's continuing range so well, are raising very often. Mainly, top 2 pair, 9-8, and pocket 3s. You're going to find that bottom set essentially never slow plays when you're playing deep stacked. And top 2 pair, especially if they're a little bit vulnerable to being outdrawn, very often raise as well. Now, you do see pocket 9s and pocket 8s slow playing some portion of the time by just calling, but that's fine. This is a situation where you should not be raising all that often, but top 2 and sets do not just call and slow play. They put in a raise. Also notice we are raising with a smattering of draws, both high equity and low equity. We have Jack 10 and 10-7 for open-ended. And then we have Queen Jack and Queen 10 for gut shots. Then we have a few random overcards or backdoor flush draws, which I think makes a whole lot of sense. But what I wanted to show you here is that you're not check raising in this scenario with too wide of a range for value. Notice like ace 9 is not check raising very often, and all the other top pairs are not raising very often. But we are check raising bottom set and top 2 pair the vast majority of the time. Do not slow play. And that's going to be especially true against players who don't like folding. Now, if your opponent's just going to check fold everything, if you are bet everything on the flop and then fold every time if you get raised, unless they have a really good hand, then maybe you do want to just check call, especially if they're going to keep barreling it off. You will find there's a lot of room for exploiting your opponents as you get deeper and deeper and deeper stacked. But in GTO world, against good players, you're going to find you don't want to slow play these hands. Tip number 3, you're going to want to master turn and river overbets. Many players play especially poorly against overbets. And if you make a point to study how to utilize them very well, you are going to absolutely smash your opponents. Here's a spot that comes up all the time. When the flop is Jack 10-3, you're going to find that the pre-flop better gets to bet the flop kind of big, bet the turn kind of big, and bet the river kind of big. Common GTO stuff. We actually discussed this thoroughly in our advanced tournament course at PokerCoaching.com, where we discuss playing deep stacked in this scenario where you should be blasting off a lot for a lot of big blinds. It applies in cash games as well. So let's take a look at this scenario. We raise pre-flop with this range. Big blind calls. Flop comes. Jack of spades, 10 of clubs, 3 of spades. There's a flush draw, and there's a straight draw on the flop. They check. We bet 3.9 big blinds. They call. Turns of 4 of clubs, 2 flush draws, 2 straight draws. This is referred to as a very dynamic board, meaning the current nuts are kind of unlikely to not be the nuts by the river. When that's in the case, you usually want, or when that is the case, you want to be betting very big with a polarized range. So right here, the pot is 14.3 big blinds. And you'll see here, the most commonly used bet size is 24.3 big blinds. 1.5 times pot, give or take. That's a big bet. If you don't want to use that size, you can bet only 11.4 big blinds for 2/3 pot. So take a look at which hands are betting big in this scenario. Jack, 10, 4, 3. Notice jacks and 10s and aces, kings, and queens are betting big every time. Ace-jack betting big every time. And then a smattering of draws. Now, the draws are going to be all over the place here, from very high equity draws to very low equity draws. Like ace-king of spades, for instance, is betting, and it's just happy loading money in. Ace-queen offsuit is betting. If it gets raised, it's pretty unhappy. It's probably going to fold. We have hands like pocket sevens being used as a bluff. That's a low equity bluff, but hey, you get to do it. We have king 7, king 6 with flush draws. Going for it, right? Sometimes without flush draws, I bet they're going for it. So you see in this scenario, we are betting big quite often with a good, strong polarized range of something like king, jack, and better, and then a smattering of draws, right? And this is a spot where you should be betting big. And the nice thing about betting big on the turn is it sets up an all-in on the river. Notice here, 7s, 5s, and 2s are over-betting the turn some portion of the time. Let's say we do bet 1.5x pot. Are we doing 1.5x pot? Yeah. 1.5x pot and the opponent calls. The river is a 7. And they check. Now, in this situation, the GTO strategy is to either go all in or check. So overbet turn, slight overbet on river. If you bet a little bit smaller on the turn, I can tell you you're going to be overbetting on the river too. So in this spot, as you see on this stone brick 7, I mean, I guess 9-8 gets there, so it's not a total brick, but notice we don't have a whole lot of 9-8s. We are betting for value all in with ace, jack, and better. Nice, clear, easy value bet all in. What else are we bluffing? Well, now we have lots of busted draws. When you have lots of busted draws, and importantly, your opponent could also have lots of busted draws themselves, you'll find these small pairs don't do a whole lot of bluffing. If this river was a spade or a club, I bet these small pairs would be bluffing some portion of the time. Anyway, here we have plenty of busted draws that don't mind going for the all-in, like king, queen, queen 9, king 9, king 8 backdoor draw, king 8, king 6 backdoor draw. Notice king 7 made a pair, so it doesn't need to bluff. Ace 6 backdoor draw, ace 5 backdoor draw. All these hands are getting after it and ripping it all in. Most people never overbet the turn. If they never bet the overturn, they definitely don't overbet the river. And that lets their opponents realize their equity better in general. And that's not good. You'll find that you make a lot of money in poker by making your opponents fold. And if you put yourself in your opponent's shoes here, say you even have, I don't know, queen jack. Say you check call the flop with queen jack, top pair, that's pretty good. Turns a 4, okay? You check, they overpot it. A lot of people become a chicken right there, and they just fold out the queen jack, and I can guarantee you, if they're folding out queen jack, you're going to win all their money because they're going to fold away all their worst hands too, right? And, you know, queen jack's one of the best hands they can have. Imagine they have 10-9 instead for middle pair. Well, they're definitely going to fold that, right? And if they don't fold it on the turn, the river's a 7, they check, and you put them all in for all their money. This is assuming we're playing 100 big blinds deep. A lot of people don't like that and they fold. If we're playing a little bit deeper stacked, you can bet even bigger on the turn and bet even bigger on the river for all in. And you're going to make most of your opponents drastically over fold. Now, I will say, you want to make sure you are exploiting your specific opponent. Many players, like I said, will fold far too often to overbets, allowing you to exploitatively use them with far too many bluffs. Back when I used to play 5-10 at Bellagio every day, there were some players who were regulars who I knew hated getting stacked. They hated it. They would simply not get stacked unless they had the nuts or close to the nuts. So you know what you do? You find spots where you know they don't have a whole lot of nut hands, perhaps because they like check raising the flop with flush draws. Well, if they check raise all their flush draws on the flop and then a flush card comes on the turn after they don't check raise, it means they don't have any flushes. And I could have flushes. That's a great spot to blast them because they're going to fold everything by the river and you win every single pot. I know it sounds crazy to say you can win every single pot from some players, but if they don't play well and they don't protect their range as well, and you've played with them a lot and you've figured out the massive mistakes they make, you will be able to absolutely demolish them. Okay? Also, some players will do the opposite. Some players will call far too often, thinking that you are trying to buy the pot. They think you're trying to push them around. And if they think that you are trying to push them around, they may call down with something like middle pair or an under pair. Well, against those players who really don't like folding, don't bluff nearly as often, right? When you're playing deep stacked poker, you can make a ton of money by exploiting your opponents. As stacks get shallower and shallower, usually there's a little bit less room to make a lot of money off your opponent's mistakes, even if the mistakes are kind of big, because the big mistakes when you're playing 25 big blinds deep may cost your opponent 1 big blind or something. But when you're playing 100 big blinds or 500 big blinds deep, when you get to the river and your opponent calls off even a little bit too often, that can result in them losing 5, 10, 20, 30 big blinds, something like that on average. And that is very important for you to realize if you know what they're doing wrong. So pay attention and massively exploit your opponents. So that's it. Those are 3 hacks to build a huge stack in cash games that will allow you to further get in there and continue crushing the whales. Get in there and battle. Number 1, splash around preflop from in position. Number 2, do not slow play on the flop. And number 3, master the use of overbets, especially on the turn and river. That's going to be it for today. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you found it useful, educational, insightful at all, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button down below. Also, click the notification bell. We have a lot of content like this coming out in the near future. We have a lot of content that came out like this in the past. Make sure you go check it out and enjoy it all. It takes a lot of effort to make these videos. We have a big team who helps with it, and without them and without you, none of this would be possible. Thank you very much. Good luck. Get in there and battle.